Planet Daiyu, a neon-lit city where everything costs something, and memory is the first thing people ditch when they arrive. In the second episode of Obi-Wan Kenobi, a man sits in a gutter, wearing the battered remnants of first-generation clone armor, the blue markings of the 501st Legion still faintly visible through the grime. He asks Obi-Wan Kenobi for a few credits, just enough for a warm meal. Obi-Wan gives him the credits and walks on. The man in that gutter is played by Temuera Morrison, the same actor who played Jango Fett in Attack of the Clones, the same actor who voiced every clone trooper in the Clone Wars animated series. He is, in a very real sense, the genetic face of the entire Grand Army of the Republic. When Morrison described that character afterward, he called him a discarded clone, left to fend for himself after the end of the Clone Wars, and somehow surviving a decade. Surviving a decade. That's the aspiration. Not a pension. Not recognition from the two governments he helped build. Not so much as a forwarding address from the Empire that replaced him with cheaper conscripts. Just surviving on a neon street where nobody looks twice at a man in old armor. What makes it genuinely horrifying rather than simply sad? Chronologically, that man is around 22 years old. His body is somewhere in its mid-40s. And in the decade that follows that scene, moving toward the Galactic Civil War, what remains of the clone troopers are chronologically in their early 30s and physically resembling men in their mid to late 60s. They were genetically designed to age at exactly twice the rate of a normal human. 10 years in the growing tanks, 20 years old at the starting gun, and then a biological clock that never stopped. Not during the war, not after the discharge, not ever. This is the story of how that decision was made, who made it, and what it cost the men who lived with it. Around 33 BBY, 1 year before the events of the Phantom Menace. A Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas was removed from the Jedi Council. His visions of coming galactic war were deemed extreme. The Council considered the Republic at peace and found his insistence on military preparation inconvenient. He was pushed out for continuing to advocate for something nobody wanted to hear, so he went ahead and commissioned it anyway. Sifo Dyas secretly contacted Prime Minister Lama Su of the ocean world Kamino and placed an order for a clone army to defend the Republic. He did it without Jedi Council authorization, without Senate approval, acting on the strength of his own prophetic conviction and whatever access to Republic funds he could leverage. By 32 BBY, the contract was placed, and Kaminoan scientists went to work on what would become the largest military production program in galactic history. Sifo Dyas never saw it finished. His shuttle was shot down over the moon of Obadiah, the Pike Syndicate, hired by Count Dooku. Dooku, the former Jedi turned Sith Lord Darth Tyrannus, then took control of the project. He brought in a Mandalorian bounty hunter named Jango Fett as the genetic template. He had the clone brains modified with organic inhibitor chips that would eventually enable Order 66. The accelerated aging, however, was Kamino's decision, not Dooku's, and not Palpatine's. No confirmed canon source links the aging rate to a Sith directive. The aging parameters were locked in as a Kaminoan engineering choice, made to fulfill the timeline Sifo Dyas had requested, an army ready in roughly a decade. The Sith inherited that design. They didn't author it. When Obi-Wan arrived on Kamino 10 years later, investigating an assassination attempt on Senator Amidala, Lama Su gave him the grand tour. Glass corridors looking out on thousands of translucent cloning tubes. Classrooms full of identical young boys drilling in formation. A running commentary delivered with the cadence of a man presenting quarterly earnings. Regarding the aging acceleration, it was essential, Lama Su explained. Otherwise, a mature clone would take a lifetime to grow. But here, they could do it in half the time. Half the time. Not a warning, not an ethical disclosure, a selling point. Kamino was a for-profit enterprise. This isn't a cynical reading. It's simply what the Kaminoans were. They built armies for clients. They were extraordinarily good at it. And when Lama Su stood in front of Obi-Wan and described a standing army of 200,000 units ready for deployment, with 1 million more well on the way. The word he used was units. Not soldiers, not people, not men. Units. The Kaminoans modified Jango Fett's genetic structure in several documented ways. They made the clones more docile and less independent than the original host. They built in the inhibitor chips, and they built in the accelerated aging. Each modification served the client's requirements. An obedient army delivered fast. The efficiency rationale is straightforward. Waiting 20 years for an army to mature was impractical given the timeline Sifo-Dyas had specified. Having that development window to 10 years solved the delivery problem. It also significantly reduced the resources spent housing, feeding, and training each clone through a full human childhood. 1 million clones at twice the aging rate is dramatically cheaper than 1 million clones aging normally. And from a pure production economic standpoint, the Kaminoans were billing for a service. Getting the product to the client faster, at lower cost, was the job. Chief Medical Scientist Nala Se, Kamino's chief biologist during the Clone Wars era, ran the specific research on age acceleration. Her documented research focus included pushing increased age acceleration to reduce the childhood age of clones as much as possible. In at least one recorded exchange with Imperial officials, she reportedly described the accelerated aging as a side effect of the genetic modification, framing it as acceptable collateral damage rather than a deliberate design feature. Side effect or design feature, the result was identical. The accelerated aging didn't stop once a clone reached physical adulthood. It was continuous, running from the moment of first cell division to the moment of death. Every clone's total lifespan, not just the path to adulthood, was approximately half that of a normal human being. They aged faster as children, faster as soldiers, and faster as old men. The clock never paused. When the Empire eventually threatened to replace clone soldiers with conscripted recruits, Lama Su's concern was commercial. His product might become obsolete. Not the men, the product. The Kaminoans weren't evil in any operatic sense. They were a corporation that built human beings, called them units, and treated their life cycle as a product cycle. There was nothing in the business model that accounted for what those units needed when the contract expired. An early Imperial scientific study, Burview Jarai's piece in the Imperial Medical Review, written approximately 8 BBY, analyzed 100 clones of 24 chronological years and confirmed each had been engineered to age at twice the rate of a normal human. The Empire's own medical apparatus documented the reality in print, published it as established fact, and then proceeded to do nothing about it, because by 8 BBY, the clones were already being phased out, and fixing the problem would have required caring about the problem. Jango Fett negotiated his own terms with the Kaminoans, and it's worth noting what he actually got out of the deal. He was paid well for providing his genetic material and training the initial cohort of soldiers. His additional personal compensation was one unaltered clone to raise as a son, Boba Fett. No growth acceleration, no behavioral modification, no inhibitor chip. Boba ages at a normal human rate and lives well into the Mandalorian era. The millions of other clones produced from Jango's genome, his face, his build, his voice, his entire physical existence reproduced at industrial scale, were delivered with every modification Boba was spared. A free man's DNA built 1 million men with no freedom and half a lifespan. Jango died at Geonosis in his own armor, on his own terms. His genetic copies aged at twice the speed and were discarded by the government they built. At the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, the Grand Army of the Republic deployed for the first time. 200,000 units, ready. The clones were chronologically 10 years old. Their bodies were 20. They were immediately sent to fight. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years, from 22 BBY to 19 BBY. Over that span, the clones aged physically from 20 to 26. They fought across hundreds of worlds. They developed individual identities, took names, built relationships with Jedi generals who, many of them, came to genuinely care about the men in their command. Jedi Master Plo Koon argued on behalf of his clones as important individuals. Captain Rex spent years serving alongside Anakin Skywalker and Ahsoka Tano, earning a trust that transcended rank and function. None of that translated into a plan for after. Order 66 came in 19 BBY. The inhibitor chips activated. Clone troopers, chronologically 13 years old, physically 26, turned on their Jedi commanders and executed most of them. The Republic became the Galactic Empire. Palpatine moved from behind his desk to a throne, and the galaxy reorganized itself around the fact of his victory. The clones who survived Order 66 had a problem nobody in power was interested in discussing. They were 13 years old, in a body that was already 26, and that body wasn't going to stop. The early Imperial years saw clone troopers still in active service, still wearing Imperial colors alongside the new conscript soldiers beginning to come through training. But the problems compounded quickly. Clones were expensive to produce. They thought too independently. Their loyalties, forged in years of shared combat, to each other and to their fallen Jedi commanders, didn't always align cleanly with an emperor who expected something cleaner than loyalty: obedience. The Kaminoans complicated matters further by attempting to maintain operational independence. Tipoca City sat on its rain-hammered ocean world, running its own programs, protecting its own institutional interests, maintaining leverage the Empire had no intention of tolerating indefinitely. That leverage ended in the Bad Batch Season 1, Episode 16, Kamino Lost, which aired August 13, 2021. In the galaxy's timeline, the destruction falls in the early Imperial period. Vice Admiral Edmund Rampart, acting under authorization from Grand Admiral Tarkin, ordered 3 Venator-class Star Destroyers to open fire on Tipoca City. The city burned. The great glass corridors where Obi-Wan had once walked among thousands of cloning tubes filled with fire and then with seawater. Tipoca City sank to the bottom of Kamino's ocean. A clone trooper stationed with Rampart's fleet reported the city's destruction, announcing in a flat military voice the obliteration of the only home every trooper in the Grand Army of the Republic had ever known. Episode accounts note the affected quality in that trooper's voice as he delivered the confirmation. He was reporting the destruction of his birthplace. Nala Se survived. She was extracted before the bombardment and transported to an Imperial facility inside Mount Tantus on the planet Wayland. Her expertise now served the Emperor's private research agenda, not the clones she had built. Whatever theoretical path existed toward addressing the accelerated aging, whatever research had been conducted, whatever possibilities remained, went to the bottom of Kamino's ocean with the servers. No new clones would be grown on Kamino. The clones already alive were it. And those clones were on a clock that was still running. The Imperial Defense Recruitment Bill formalized what the Empire had already decided in practice. Confirmed in the Bad Batch Season 2, the bill legally accelerated the transition from clone soldiers to a conscripted stormtrooper force, TK troopers drawn from the general population, cheaper to maintain, easier to replace, and unencumbered by the complex loyalties clone troopers carried. Vice Admiral Rampart championed early enlisted recruitment even before the bill formally passed. The official StarWars.com databank entry on the clone transition states it plainly. The Defense Recruitment Bill hastened the creation of the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps, following Kamino's destruction. By approximately 5 years after the Clone Wars, around 14 BBY, normal volunteers had almost entirely replaced clone troopers in Imperial service. Some clones were retained briefly in transitional roles. Gregor served briefly as an instructor, training the Empire's first wave of stormtroopers before departing. He spent some time teaching the men replacing him how to fight, and then he left. What the clones received upon discharge isn't recorded in any explicit Imperial policy document in the available canon. There is no confirmed decree addressing their pensions, their medical needs, or their transition to civilian life. The empire that built a trillion-credit military apparatus on the backs of clone troopers apparently didn't allocate meaningful resources to what those troopers were supposed to do next. The on-screen evidence fills in what the policy documents don't say. A man in 501st armor on the streets of Daiyu, a decade after the war, asking for credits to eat. Here is what the aging math actually looks like in human terms. Born 32 BBY. At the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY. Chronologically 10 years old, physically 20. At Order 66 in 19 BBY. Chronologically 13, physically 26. By the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, set approximately 9 years before the Battle of Yavin, chronologically 22, physically 44. By Star Wars Rebels Season 2, set 4 to 3 years before Yavin, chronologically 28 or 29, physically 56 to 58. At the Battle of Yavin itself, chronologically 32 years old, physically 64. 32 years old on paper, 64 in the mirror. Star Wars Rebels Season 2, Episode 1, The Lost Commanders, put faces on those numbers. Captain Rex, Commander Wolf, and Clone Commando Gregor are living in a retrofitted ATTE walker in the remote Selos system, far from anything that might recognize what they used to be. They chose isolation. Chronologically, they're 28 to 29 years old. Rex's hair is white. His face carries deep lines. He moves with the deliberate weight of a man whose body has been earned. Wolf stands beside him, similarly marked, carrying old damage from his years of service and a head wound sustained during the war. Gregor is there too, his mind affected by earlier injuries, his body accelerating toward an end that his birth year doesn't justify. Lucasfilm's own Pablo Hidalgo confirmed directly in an official Rebels recon feature that adult clones age about twice as fast as normal humans, and that the original clone troopers grew old enough to simply be phased out in the early years of the Empire. Grew old enough to be phased out. As though rapidly accelerating biological deterioration were simply a logistical inconvenience to be managed, rather than a deliberate consequence of decisions made in a boardroom on a rain-swept ocean world. Gregor's death during the events of Rebels, which close out around 0 BBY, puts his chronological age at roughly 32. His physical age was the equivalent of 64. He spent what would have been his entire natural adult life in combat, then in hiding, then in combat again. His body aged out at 64, while his paperwork said 32. The Imperial Medical Review documented this reality in 8 BBY, studying 100 clones of 24 chronological years, and confirming the 2 times rate as established fact in print. The Empire knew precisely what was happening to these men. It just wasn't the Empire's problem anymore. Men bred to be soldiers have no civilian preparation, no family networks built outside the barracks, no employment history that maps to an open economy. When discharge came, without documented support, without a structured transition, the clones were released into a galaxy they had protected but never navigated, with bodies aging faster than their experience of civilian life could compensate for, and an accelerating biological clock with no institutional cushion to absorb the fall. The ones who found each other, who had a Rex or a Wolf to go underground with, a network or a cause worth carrying, had some chance. The ones who didn't were heading toward exactly one destination. The man on Daiyu didn't have a Rex. His armor identifies him as 501st Legion. The credits list him simply as Veteran Clone Trooper. Temuera Morrison played him, and when Morrison described the character after filming, he was quiet and specific. A discarded clone, left to fend for himself after the end of the Clone Wars, and somehow surviving a decade. The scene is set approximately 9 BBY. Chronologically, this man is around 22 years old. Physically, he is closer to 44. His armor is worn, first-generation clone gear, not newer Imperial kit. The armor he was issued when the army was born, maintained through a decade of whatever came after discharge. He sits in shadow on a neon street. He asks for credits to eat. Obi-Wan Kenobi, who fought alongside men like this, who watched the 500 first bleed on a dozen different worlds, gives him the money, and keeps moving. Morrison reportedly called this the best part of the whole Obi-Wan Kenobi show. What that scene communicates, without a single line of explicit dialogue about clone biology or Imperial policy, is the entire argument. This is the machine's output when you run it to completion. Engineer a man to age twice as fast, use him up in a war, replace him with cheaper soldiers, destroy the facility where he was born, pass a bill that formalizes his obsolescence, and then leave him to figure out the rest. He figures out Daiyu. He figures out a gutter and a bowl of something warm if a passing Jedi happens to have loose credits. The 501st Legion was one of the most decorated units in the Grand Army of the Republic. Their symbol, still visible on that battered pauldron, once meant something to the men who wore it and the commanders who fought beside them. On Daiyu, it marks a man asking for change on a street that has no idea who he is. Captain Rex is the counterpoint. He is the story that goes differently, and that difference is the whole point. Rex had removed his inhibitor chip before Order 66, with Ahsoka Tano's help. He had prior knowledge of the chip's existence from a clone trooper named Fives, whose own chip had malfunctioned prematurely during the Clone Wars. When Order 66 came, Rex resisted the command long enough for Ahsoka to complete the chip removal. They faked their deaths and went underground. In the years that followed, Rex worked to free other clones from Imperial service through the network that became known as the Clone Underground. He eventually settled in the Silo system with Wolf and Gregor, 3 men in their late 20s chronologically, their late 50s physically, living in a walker at the edge of the galaxy. When Ahsoka tracked them down and brought them back into contact with the growing Rebel Alliance, Rex came back into the fight. He served alongside Rebel forces through the events of Star Wars Rebels. The Rebels Season 4 finale confirmed he fought at the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY. At Endor, Rex would be chronologically 36 years old. The 2 times aging rate makes him the biological equivalent of a man in his early 70s, still on a battlefield, still functional, still committed to something larger than himself. Rex didn't escape the aging. He carried it toward something worth carrying it toward. But that path required an almost implausible chain of specific circumstances. Fives discovering the chips and passing that knowledge on, Rex retaining that knowledge through Order 66, Ahsoka's presence and the surgical removal working cleanly, years of underground work with loyal brothers, and eventually, reconnection with people who still had a use for an old soldier. Remove any single link in that chain, and Rex ends up somewhere between Wolf's isolation and Daiyu's gutter. He isn't proof the system worked. He is proof that one man, given the right combination of luck and loyalty and timing, found a way through a system designed to consume him. Rex's survival is a credit to Rex. It isn't a defense of what was done to him. The gap between Rex at Endor and the unnamed veteran on Daiyu isn't a gap of courage or commitment or willingness to serve. Both men came from the same genetic template, grew up in the same facilities, fought in the same war. One found a purpose that kept him moving through the aging. The other found a city that had never heard his name. They were bred to fight. They were also bred to die young. That was never an accident. The accelerated aging was written into their genome on Camino by scientists who counted them in units and priced them against a delivery schedule. The Kaminoans built what they were paid to build. The Republic commissioned what it needed and declined to ask what the long-term plan was for the men being manufactured. The Sith inherited the project and found the existing design more than adequate for their purposes. The Empire inherited an aging army and decided, with the cold efficiency of a government that has other priorities, that those men were no longer worth maintaining. By the time the Defense Recruitment Bill passed and the last clone instructors finished training their replacements, the men being phased out were already living in bodies running ahead of their years. By the Battle of Yavin, the ones still alive were 32 on paper and 64 in the mirror. By Endor, The few survivors were pushing 72 biologically, while their documentation said 36. They won both wars, the Clone Wars, and for the few who made it that far, the Galactic Civil War. None of them were supposed to live long enough to see what winning cost them. The man on Daiyu understood that, sitting in a gutter in 501st armor, on a planet that had never heard of him, asking a passing stranger for the price of a meal. Temuera Morrison understood it. And if you've never quite connected the dots between the clones age twice as fast and what that actually looks like on a human face 20 years after the war in the wrong city, now you have. Subscribe for more stories like this one.